Studio Dean's 2006 anime Higurashi no Naku Koro ni is a spectacle of tonal and narrative intrigue. Having watched it only earlier this year and finding it to be a solid 9 out of 10, I was interested to hear that a new adaptation made by Passion would be airing in October. Here we are, the first episode has aired, and despite its numerous similarities to Studio Dean's first episode, something about it felt off. This is the premise I would like to explore. What could have caused something so similar to feel so different? I will be comparing the first episodes on an anime-only basis, not as how they compare to the visual novels. An adaptation will always lose something in translation, but it will always gain something in return. That and not enough of the new series has aired to make any judgments on how well it adapts the narrative. Don't worry, there won't be any spoilers outside of anything shown within their respective first episodes. Let me start by saying this episode does a lot right. For all intents and purposes, it's a good episode. After all, the two are basically the same, but barring minor instances which I will cover later, just about anything the 2020 episode does well was done just as well in the 2006 version. The issues, though not egregious, are found in the few differences that do arise. I suppose I should say these changes are not bad just because they are different. Rather, it comes down to the effects that these changes have on the episode's feeling of cohesion, as minor or major as they may be. The first and most notable change made in the 2020 adaptation is to the art style. Every character is drawn with highly saturated colors and these strange, pure white highlights in their hair that serve to make them look shiny, almost as if they were covered in oil. Whether or not you think this looks good is down to personal preference, but Studio Dean's character designs feel more cohesive in regards to the overall style and feeling of the show. To illustrate, let's compare the most egregious example, Reina. In the 2006 anime, Reina has a natural shade of light brown hair. Nothing special, but it fits in well enough that the color of her hair never even crossed my mind. But in the 2020 anime, the character designer opted for this garish, bright orange. I mean, look at this. Anime characters are known for their candy-colored hair, sure, but in a show with as serious a subject matter and grounded tone as Higurashi, this super saturated color looks out of place, to say the least. In the original visual novel, she had natural orange hair. This looked fine, as it's not the color I take issue with, rather the saturation thereof. Hair color is something that doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But it's not just the hair, it's present everywhere in the character designs. Look at the way in which the characters clash with their environments. The background art is rendered in this beautiful, highly detailed painterly art style with natural tones all throughout. But the characters are drawn crisp and smoothly, with colors that completely contrast with the backdrop. It looks as if they do not fit within the world they inhabit. Rather, they look like characters pasted onto a background. This ultimately leads to a decrease in the overall immersion and, by extension, investment. Look at the way the 2006 anime balances its background and character art. You could make the argument that neither element looks as detailed or clean respectively, but it's plainly obvious which one looks more cohesive. This is one of those facts of design where when it's done correctly, you never even notice it, but when it's done wrong, it's all I can think about. In fact, the Passion adaptation actually gets this very thing correct at a couple of points in the episode. Here, the scene has a filter placed over it, giving everything a darker, less saturated look. Lo and behold, the characters fit right in. If the characters looked this at home for the rest of the episode, there wouldn't be any issue. But they don't. Anime is a visual medium. Art is a major factor towards a show's quality, so this feels inexcusable. To nitpick, I would say the characters that got off the worst would be Keiichi, Reina, and Rika, where the characters who were affected the least would be Mion, Satoko, and this guy. But if lackluster visuals were the only issue plaguing this episode, I wouldn't be making this video. No, the problems run deeper. The biggest issues are in introductory structure and characterization. Structurally, most of this episode is essentially the same, but there are some differences that stand out. Primarily our introduction into the dynamic of our main cast's club. Not so spoiler, this whole part is meant to be symbolic of things to come, though I won't get into that in this video. I think it's important to mention since it gives weight to what I'm talking about. First, let's look at where Studio Dean went right. We are introduced to their club and by extension their dynamic through Keiichi. The group is playing a simple game of cards, except it's not just a game of cards, it's a game of minds. Each card has been memorized by their unique bends and marks. These girls are observant and intelligent. The audience learns this as Keiichi learns this. It feels like a natural introduction into the group, and it means that as a viewer, we might feel clever figuring out the solution before or just as Keiichi does when he tricks Mion by simply adding a new bend to one of his cards. Of course, he still loses in the end, but while he may not have won the war, he at least won a battle. That's a theme that crops up plenty of times in the rest of the series. This portrays Keiichi as intelligent as he is. His only weakness was unfamiliarity and the ruthless nature of the club. In Passion's adaptation, instead we are presented with their dynamic set in place, with Keiichi already being an established member of the club and attempting to outsmart Satoko's traps or stay one step ahead of Mion's games. Early in the episode, in trying to stay one step ahead of a door trap set up by Satoko, he becomes short-sighted and ultimately still falls victim to her multi-layered setup. Despite being rather obvious to the audience, I think this is one of the better changes made to the episode. It gives us a decent insight into the mind of Keiichi, and has some foreshadowing as well. In fact, it does a better job portraying Satoko's character than in Dean's. Props. Where I think this episode ends up falling behind, however, is during the scavenger hunt, wherein each character is on a hunt to find the pen used in the punishment game, which, by the way, is only ever mentioned, never shown, unlike in the 2006 version. This hunt replaces the card game from the original. In rapid succession, we see Keiichi begin to look around the classroom, realize it's probably hidden somewhere he hasn't been, run to a storage room where he finds the pen and Reina. She's only there to tell a piece of exposition that, while present in the 2006 version, feels much more out of place here. In the end, he's thwarted when Rika and Satoko come out of nowhere to grab the pen. Satoko pulls one of her traps, beating out Rika and ultimately winning. This whole segment doesn't end up telling us much of anything new about any of the characters, except that Satoko is good with traps and Keiichi can at least think a few steps ahead. Both facts we already learned earlier on, and neither were portrayed any better here than they were earlier. Satoko's trap feels like a bit of a get out of jail free card, since it's unlikely she had the time to set it up during the scavenger hunt and had no way of knowing it was going to be there earlier. Unless she just has traps conveniently littered throughout every single inch of the school, this feels like a cop-out. Earlier in the episode, the trap felt like something that somebody would have actually set up as a prank, since she would have had the foresight that Keiichi, or whoever she was trying to prank, would at some point walk through the classroom door. On the other hand, Keiichi's thinking here feels less satisfying than in the 2006 anime, since it's based on information that we, the viewer, had no access to. In the card game, all information about the problem is shown to us. It's something that the viewer could likely solve the moment they realize what the trick is. But here we were never told that Keiichi had never visited the storage room. It feels less like an actual game, and more like the episode merely telling us something because it has to. Overall, the whole scene goes by so quickly that there would be no time to characterize anyone anyway. It all feels like wasted potential and wasted time, especially since the 2006 anime does it so well. If it were given time to develop itself, this scene could have worked well as the second time we see them engage in a game, since it would show us a different side to the characters that you couldn't show sitting down. But by having it be our first introduction into these sort of things, as well as having it be so underdeveloped, it left me feeling unsatisfied. Canonically, this scene takes place after the card game, which is actually mentioned in the Passion adaptation. But a wink and a nod to a better scene is honestly even worse than if they had just let it stand on its own. Another big issue present is in the way that the Passion adaptation has thus far presented its characters. Compared to Dean's, they feel over the top, almost to the point of, dare I say it, Flanderization. The horror. No, I don't think it's quite that bad, but many of their character quirks are played up far more than they ever were in Studio Dean's first episode. This means while we get a stronger sense of who the characters are, they feel less believable as people, and instead feel like mere two-dimensional characters much of the time. Once again, taking Reina as an example, in the 2006 anime, she is portrayed as a nice, intelligent girl who likes cute things, but is a bit unconventional in this regard. In the 2020 adaptation, she is nigh obsessive, with almost every scene she's in having her make that noise she likes to make. I wouldn't have minded if they increased the frequency of that quirk a little bit, since one could argue it was underplayed in the 2006 episode, but as it stands, it just feels out of place. Keiichi, the main character of the episode, is also not as well realized as in the 2006 anime. I would say this comes down to the fact that they removed his inner monologue. You could argue this cuts down on exposition, since you no longer have a character explaining the setting and facts about those around him. This is a fair way of looking at it, but I think the inner monologue is not just there for exposition, since it gives an insight into Keiichi's mind. The way his thoughts are colored by his perspective and way of thinking mean a stronger character overall. It gives a feel for who he is, how he views the world, and helps better explain why he does what he does. And at least in this arc, he's a very important character to understand. Overall, most of the changes felt incredibly on the nose, to the point where it felt as though they were changing things not to improve upon where the old adaptation failed, but instead just so they could justify making a new show. So anywhere a change occurred, they attempted to capture what made the original scene work, but instead only copied surface level elements or pieces of information. Listen to the way suspicious lines of dialogue are delivered in the 2020 version compared to the 2006 version.
事故とか
知らない。
事故とか事件
知らない。
殺人
なかった。
殺人
なかった。
They feel as if much more weight was placed behind them, rather than letting the lines speak for themselves. This one in particular sounds like they cut the voice clip off too early.
知らない。
This makes the episode feel less realistic. In Studio Dean's anime, it sounds like the characters are actually trying to obscure information without drawing too much attention to it. In Passion's, so much emphasis was placed on each of these lines that it undercuts the character's intention. All of this wouldn't be nearly as annoying if this were the first adaptation, but because an adaptation already exists, the bare minimum standard of quality should at least be better than the original. But it's not. In many ways, it's worse. So the question arises, what was the point? Now, this has only been a piece of preliminary analysis, so nothing I've said here is necessarily going to be the case for the rest of the series, since technically anything could happen. But generally speaking, the first episode is a good indicator of things to come. I will be revisiting this show once it has finished airing to see if any of my opinions have changed. I really want to like this, since there are plenty of places where Studio Dean's anime felt uneven, especially in the second season, and who knows, maybe the visuals will grow on me. It's only the first episode after all. In any case, if you liked this video, consider supporting me on Patreon, or at the very least, check out my second channel, which gets content much more frequently. While you're at it, follow me on Twitter, link in the description. And now that everybody else has left, let me just say this. Fuck this stupid fucking ending screen. This shit pissed me off like no other. What kind of on-the-nose bullshit is that? God damn it, Passion, you had one job. Fuck.